One of the great benefits of these kinds of forums is to meet other people, to learn from them, to exchange business cards and contact information. You'll have a chance to do that. You'll have a chance to do that during lunch.
I'm going to talk about standards as well.
You'll have a chance to do that at least for the half hour when we have lunch, when we complete the program. We have some great people, relatively.
Yeah, it's always that like, is my tie straight?
Can we get everybody in?
Tie straight.
Freshman room there.
Needs to hear me. They're here to hear you guys. I don't think they ever got it.
Got into these wool ties, but they're terrible. See how they...
Yeah, I've got a few of those.
We want to keep on track. We knew it was a risk to have a break.
Yeah, I did. I went to a school where you had to wear a tie
Plastic.
and a blazer.
For the younger kids.
Oh, yeah, elastic ones.
Derek, can we get everybody to sit down? And
Plastic, it wasn't very pleasurable.
if I can get Derek to sit down, that's a big accomplishment. So,
Water I'm drinking, that one.
okay, we're moving on to our next panel. Delighted that Brent Parton from the New America Foundation, who's actually been a very quick learner on apprenticeship over recent years. Brent was a great moderator at a Wisconsin summit a couple of years ago. I don't know, what, 3-4 years ago? And has turned his attention to youth apprenticeship, where he'll be having a major report coming out when?
December.
December, okay. So it'll
Thanks
be a
for the
nice
reminder.
Christmas present for all of us to get that. Some of you may realize we have at least some proceedings volumes from our international conference that are out on the table. And we're now turning to our second substantive panel dealing with occupational frameworks, one of the critical elements of a robust apprenticeship system. Take it away, Brent.
Great. Well, good morning, everyone. That'll be a hard first panel to follow, but the topic here we have is on occupational frameworks and competencies, how broad, how narrow. If the key question of the last panel was who should pay, I think the simplified question for this panel is what should an apprentice learn, and really who decides that. And it's a fascinating question. It's one that's not necessarily for the faint of heart, but we have a great panel here to help us break it down and understand it. Just at a high level, this question of what does an apprentice learn, it really has to be a balancing act. We heard about the idea of the old-fashioned types of apprenticeships from many centuries ago, and the idea of almost this sense of indentured servitude. So how do you balance this idea of the skills that an apprentice needs to learn, where they're not too narrow to the needs of any individual employer, but really they're applicable and portable across an industry to ensure an apprentice can not only build on those skills over time, but they're able to go take them from one employer to another employer, from industry to industry. At the same time, if the skills and competencies an apprentice learns is not relevant to the job at hand, it doesn't drive value for the company at all. And that, of course, as we've talked about from the last panel, compromises the entire value proposition for an apprenticeship altogether. The last thing I want to say to tee this up is that in countries where apprenticeship has achieved scale, there's been some mechanism, some strategy, some process for really creating an industry-wide approach towards skills and qualifications that apprenticeships should offer apprentices. The reason for doing that is that employers themselves don't have to start from scratch. Whereas you look in places in Europe, the UK is an example, but also in Germany and Switzerland, there's some national mechanism for aggregating the skills and needs of an industry and creating what is often called a qualifications framework that really creates guideposts for the skills apprentices should learn. Back here stateside, it's a much more retail type of process. And that's really been a hard nut to crack in order to achieve scale. And it's something we're really excited to learn about the perspective and as well as the experiences of other countries to how we can address this issue to really make it easier for more employers to opt in and engage with apprenticeship. So we have a great panel to talk to us about their multiple perspectives. Here we have Anna Lloyd next to me. She's the Managing Director of Element Skills Training in the United Kingdom. Next to Hannah, we have David Willett of the Open University, also in the United Kingdom. Next to David is Nick Wyman. He's of the Skilling Australia Foundation, but that is one of many pursuits as I've gotten to know Nick, but he'll talk to us a little bit about how this has played out in Australia and what he's seen here in the US. And next to Nick is Daniel Keene from right here at the Urban Institute. And Daniel's been a part of some really exciting work to kind of create these occupational frameworks in a way that creates a little bit more of a model that, again, employers can use to not start building apprenticeship programs from scratch. So we'll have him share a little bit about that work. Please be thinking about your questions. We want to keep this fast moving and interactive to our online audience around the world and across the Atlantic. You can submit those questions to events@urban.org, and we will try to get to those as well. But let's go ahead and get started. And David, I want to start with you because you've been engaged in this apprenticeship work for quite a while from many perspectives. Talk to us a little bit, just so as a bit of background, how this balance of creating competencies and skills that aren't too narrow but not too broad, how that balance is struck in the UK system and how has that sort of approach evolved over time?
Okay, good morning. Thank you, everybody. I guess, there's been a significant amount of change in the UK and we've been learning lessons ourselves, particularly over the last 3 or 4 years. We've been being led much more in this field by employers. So the government is trying to create very much an employer-led system around the development of standards and competencies. What we've been doing is using groups of employers. They've been known as trailblazers, and those groups of employers have been developing apprenticeship standards around single occupational areas. And those standards then are applicable to a whole range of employers and even across a range of sectors. So if we think of some examples like IT, perhaps there have been trailblazer groups that have developed a range of standards within IT, or there could have been a range of standards within engineering or other occupational areas. The trailblazer groups themselves are made up of just employers in the main, so there are no providers or suppliers in the development of those standards. There must be at least 10 employers as a minimum involved, and there must be both large and small employers. So the groups are made up of a real cross-section of the industry. And we write those standards in a very simple format that's the same across every apprenticeship standard. They have to specify on 2 pages of A4 the skills, the knowledge and the behaviours required to achieve that particular occupational role. So quite simple at quite a high level. Those standards are then approved now by our newly formed Institute for Apprenticeship, so they're holding the fort, if you like, on quality and quality assurance. And once they're approved, there's then a more detailed set of guidance around how you would deliver the qualifications and, most importantly, how you would assess and quality assure them, and how you might even link them to existing qualifications or new qualifications, whether they be professional qualifications or whether they be degrees, etc. So that's where we are. Those standards are all published on a single website on the web, so all employers can access the standards and all providers can access the same standards.
So just as a quick follow-up, Andy brought this up on the past panel, the idea of an industry-wide approach to sort of determining skills needs. Just give us, drilling down for 1 second, who brings together these trailblazers? Like, who's responsible for bringing them together and facilitating these conversations across employers in an industry?
Yeah, so they are predominantly being led by employers, and in some cases that's very large employers, in some cases it's small employers. There are examples of where professional bodies or institutes are bringing those employers together to create standards for that particular industry.
Great, thank you. So Hannah, building off that, how does this work on the ground? You're involved in the intermediary space. So how has this made your job, having this function, easier to work with individual employers to set up apprenticeships?
Okay, well, we look at how we develop these standards to actual reality. So as part of our delivery, we're part of the Register of Apprenticeship Training Providers. So everybody in England needs to be part of that group to be able to deliver any standard that's an apprenticeship. So it regulates what we're allowed to do with quality delivery and our financial due diligence. We then put those standards out to our employers, making sure we've got the right teams on board, and allow the employers a little bit of development in their own right to make it unique for them. So it's all very well saying, here we have our competencies and that's it, But every employer, we all know every employer is very different, and they want to make something that's a little bit unique for themselves to really add that value and return on investment. With the pillars that create the standards, we're given the tools almost, just like a toolkit, to develop and deliver against core competencies that are transferable skills. So if, for example, our apprentices wish to move, they know that they can go to another employer. That employer knows what skills they've already got and just needs to add something that's unique to their business. So it turns it on its head to what we're used to. We give people that flexibility to use what's common and what's gradually being adopted, but also they can check to see the quality of delivery, so what our success rates are. So we're measured by that success with the endpoint assessment, checking that the employer is happy, the learner is happy, and they're capable of taking theory to applied.
So we often hear, as a quick follow-up to that, what's the right blend? You mentioned employers like to customize a little bit off those trainings. We hear something like the 80-20 rule. I've heard the 50-50 rule. Give me your best sense of a percentage of what your employer partners like.
If I give you a large engineering company, I think that's the easy one. They wanted a standard in non-destructive testing. That's great. They are using composite non-destructive testing. That's what they want. So they wanted to add a more composite element to that particular standard. So for them, it was more of an 80% is what they wanted as a standard. And then they wanted this little unique part, which included CATIA for 3D design and composite, to give it something unique for them. My other company that's dealing with non-destructive testing does ball bearings. So they don't want to know about composites, and they don't want to know about the difference in CATIA, so they took it on more of a quality business improvement technique journey.
That's great. So Nick, I want to turn to you. So give us a little bit of sense of the Australian approach to this. Is it a similar one in terms of sort of working to develop, again, these industry-wide standards, or how does Australia's system go about this balance between customizing to the needs of the employer or keeping it broad enough for many to buy in?
I think Australia, if you look at it as a whole, we've got a real focus on competency-based training at the moment, and that really allows students to progress at their own rate, but that does come with some challenges. And Australia's got a hangover, not from a big night out, from 2 decades of mining. The country really has been able to sit back and dig up its natural resources, and so we're going through this rapid change. So there are some who are questioning, how is this, fairly rigid competency-based training going to work in a rapidly changing marketplace. But one thing we have learnt, and I think that we've done pretty well, is this idea of engaging the employers as a part of this process. We get them in the framework conversation, we get them at the table, and that's absolutely a critical and key element. Because otherwise, training, without a job at the end of it is just training for training's sake. And I think we've got to keep reminding ourselves as to what apprenticeship is, and I think that's something, to look at.
You raised something that is a common theme of getting employers at the table to do this. Let me ask you this. There's maybe a chicken and egg scenario here. Do the employers have to be interested in apprenticeship to come to the table, or do you have a conversation about skills that leads to apprenticeship?
So there's 2 ways to have this conversation. One is around philanthropic need, and maybe to the earlier question about why should the government invest any taxpayers' dollars from the public purse in this debate. My conversations with employers, and I work with about 200 employers and personally employ 800 apprentices, we very much base it around their skills need. So we go to an employer and say, what is your skills need? And one of the reasons they're drawn to our competencies and frameworks is that you can be in, we certainly don't have as many states and territories as the United States, but we still have 8 territories and states, and I can have a qualification in my home state, and I can go and work in any part of Australia without any question at all. And that idea that your qualification is nationally recognised is a huge draw card to employers. If you're in transport and logistics, there's a company, Toll Freight, who we work with, large international company. We can have people trained in anywhere in the country and it's the same qualification, and that's huge to an employer. Otherwise, a lot of back office work.
Right. So Dan, I want to turn to you now to help us understand where this all looks like in the domestic context. And I want to be clear too. The U.S. traditionally, our approach to apprenticeship has been, yes, there are employer by employer, firm by firm approaches, but where apprenticeship is large in the U.S. and traditional sectors like construction and to some extent manufacturing, there are mechanisms to aggregate sort of skills needs. Organized labor has played that role traditionally in the U.S. But talk to us a little bit how you're working in these non-traditional sectors where that infrastructure for sort of aggregating skills needs, developing common standards isn't there. What steps are you all taking?
Mm-hmm. Well, so I'll start with the U.S. context. You're right that in the United States, it varies much more by employers. All employers have to have what's called a work process schedule approved either by the Office of Apprenticeship or by a state agency, if a state agency is operating in that state. And that lays out what they have to learn in the on-the-job training, what they have to learn in the related technical instruction, and usually a wage progression as well. There are at least 3 layers of complexity to this in the United States. First, we just have a lot of different occupations that we apprentice in. There's over 1,300 currently apprenticeable occupations, and if you look at the way the federal government officially counts occupations in the economy, there's only about 800 detailed occupations in the economy. And the reason for that isn't that every occupation is using apprenticeship. It's because all of these apprenticeable occupations have subspecialties and different alternatives. And so that's one complexity. The other complexity is as you've mentioned, that it varies by state. Different state agencies have to adopt these apprenticeship standards, and licensure varies across states. And then finally, that employers can customize it. So that's the situation in the United States. At the Urban Institute, Bob and Diane and others are working to develop what they're calling national occupational frameworks that can bring some of this consistency that we see in the United Kingdom to the United States. And the Urban team goes out and talks to employers to identify the key job functions in 50 different occupations is where they're starting, and it does tend to be these non-traditional occupations, healthcare, IT. So they talk to the employers, identify the important job functions, and then try to distill those job functions into competencies, which are more actionable statements of what apprentices are expected to do. And then within each competency, there are performance standards. And so that's what the apprentice can actually demonstrate to show that they've achieved these competencies. So they're just getting started with that work. We are using the 80-20 rule so that if employers keep 80% of the competencies, then they're on an expedited review with the Office of Apprenticeship, not necessarily with all the state agencies, but with the Office of Apprenticeship, and that helps them to move it through quicker and be confident that things will be approved.
And I'll say this, just to play devil's advocate, we've worked in this country for many years in different ways to try to develop skills standards that are broadly accepted across a number of employers. Just give us a sense of what your approach has been to validate these frameworks with employers and industry at large.
Well, so it starts with employers and with conversations with employers themselves as well as skilled workers. And that's where the competencies are first developed. Then it's reviewed against any existing competencies in the Competency Clearinghouse, NIMS competencies, things like that might already exist in the industry. And then they also look at the ONET database, which talks about the knowledge, skills, and abilities that different occupations need. And so with all that information, the frameworks are developed, and then it's vetted by the Office of Apprenticeship, additional groups of employers, and other stakeholders.
That's great. So get your questions ready and fired up. I'm going to do one more round of questions and kind of flip the perspective here a little bit. We talk a little bit about the employer side of this. I want to talk a little bit from the apprentice perspective and the importance of portability, not just from one employer to another, but the ability to sort of build on your apprenticeship and increase your skills and increase your education over time. Could you all just comment on sort of, and then maybe David and Hannah first, around how the UK has created a system where apprentices can continue to build on their skills and how you create competencies and skills frameworks that allow that to happen?
Yeah, I think, well, if I pick up the first bit of this, and then you can follow on. What we have done in the development of those standards is develop them at a variety of educational levels. So they don't translate very well to the US, but we have intermediate level skills, and we have then approaching higher, and then we have degree apprenticeship skills. So there is a real opportunity for people to enter a career at a very early stage and then progress using the apprenticeship model all the way up to degree, and in fact now even to postgraduate. So you can now go all the way through. So you could leave school at 16 in the UK and start a work-based apprenticeship and work your way through the apprenticeship levels all the way up to a master's level apprenticeship program. So I think one of the great things about apprenticeship, and one of the things we've done, and it's not been easy, is give actually a route for young people to be able to progress, but also a route for existing workforces. And I think this is something that's been mentioned a couple of times today. We shouldn't forget that actually, you know, something like in the UK, 70% of our workforce that are already in work will still be there by 2030. So, you know, with the advent of technology and improved healthcare, we're going to have an aging workforce, and many, with, you know, the introduction of technology, many of those people are going to need to be able to reskill and upskill, and so using the apprenticeship as a vehicle to do that also helps and allows them to increase their levels as well.
For us, it's about how we give controlled and beneficial advice and guidance. So meeting the aspirations of that individual, assessing where they can get to in their career path, what their personal employment and skills plan is, which matches with potentially the employer or whatever apprenticeships are out there. But how we ensure that, for us in England, as David mentioned, lifelong learning is pretty key. There is not such a thing in England at the moment that a job is for life. There is 1, 2, possibly 3 different career paths someone will go on. So as long as we can take the apprenticeships and use them as a stepping stone mentality, then we can get people into different careers, recognising prior achievement and skills that they've already obtained because they've got that certification process at the end.
So coming stateside, and Nick, I know you've been going around working with a lot of folks stateside and hearing about issues there, and same question to you as well, Dan. You know, you hear this perception, I think in America that's common, apprenticeship is seen by some as a dead end. So you heard about this approach here in the UK. How do we ensure that competency development really combats that and shows that apprentices can build on their skills over time? What are you seeing out there?
Well, I think it really is key to make sure that these occupational frameworks and the competencies are national frameworks, because we do have industry recognized credentials, and there's a lot of employers already use credentials that lots of other employers recognize, but those proliferate as well, right? The national occupational frameworks, I think, ensure, as people have said, that if you go through an apprenticeship in one state and you move across states or even to a different employer within the same state, they all know what that is. It isn't just this proliferation of validated industry credentials, but it really is a national framework.
And Nick, to you, do you see this issue of not having these ready-made frameworks in your work here in the U.S. is really a major barrier to expansion?
Well, I think it's got to be about an adaptable workforce. You know, the US is like many countries, you know, with rapidly changing technology, globalisation, and it really is that emphasis on capability, so students can realise a number of outcomes. And I think that's your point. So that's really where I see the focus, that it really needs to be. You know, prepare students for, you know, broad occupations. So I think that's where attention, you know, should be really focused in that area.
Great. So we're about time now to turn to the audience some questions. We can start there. So if we have any in the room that we want to go from right ahead, let's go over here first.
So yeah, what you were just talking about the progression and the portability. Obviously in the UK we've got the MVQ system, and it's very clear where you stand in terms of what stage of your apprenticeship you're at versus, you know, an equivalent progression, let's say in traditional university or whatever. That, you know, how do we transition or build a system that achieves the same outcomes of that in the US, so that you can, let's say, finish an apprenticeship and then actually have that as a recognised qualification that is equivalent to, you know, levels of education that the market's already used to, and is therefore portable, because that's, I think, like one of the key things that's currently missing that would help us get over this stigma of apprenticeships as maybe a second-rate mechanism or like a dead end, like you said.
So, and please address what the NVQ is for our American audience and how that sort of connects with the broader education system.
Yeah, so NVQs are national vocational qualifications, and they give us an ability to level apprenticeships within the UK. I think just coming to the end of the point you're making, Steve, it is, you know, what we've been striving for in the UK is parity of esteem with apprenticeships, and you know, we're doing great things. We've still got a long way to go, and I think we're seeing that here definitely in the US. There's a lot of, you know, what will help you expand and grow rapidly will be about promoting and showing that apprenticeships give parity esteem with those other routes. You know, it isn't an either or. Both routes, whether you go into college and university or whether you come through an apprenticeship route, can take you to the same place. They're just different roads that you go down. What we've done in the UK, I think, is really shouted about that a lot, and we've got some very large employers who've created some great case studies and being able to really demonstrate. So employers have done lots and lots of marketing about how successful apprentices are actually progressing in their organisations, but helping their businesses become more productive, more, you know, and ultimately more profitable as well.
If I can just jump in as well, we did an exercise back in 2008 where we compared the level of apprenticeships against the level of college qualifications and degree qualifications, so that we were able to map qualifications from level 2, which is the intermediate, right the way to level 8. And we've done that as a way of trying to ensure businesses, learners especially, and parents understand where they can chart their qualifications in the grand scheme of things. So I hope that answers a little bit more.
Great. I actually had a question in the back that was next.
I was wondering if you could tell us how difficult it is for employers to comply with your standards. So do you find that employers propose apprenticeship programs and they get turned down, or do you find that they are generally automatically approved?
Do you want to go first?
Okay. The Trailblazer groups gave a lot of credibility for the big, large employers and the SMEs to get a lot of the new standards through. Some of the standards, there wasn't enough uptake, or there didn't seem to be enough of a labour market drive behind it to give parity of scale to make sure that they were approved. So we have a mechanism where it goes to Ofqual, which is a regulatory body in the UK, and in some cases the standards didn't get through. Some took a lot longer. So it's a bit of a catch-22. You could have a niche market standard, but it may not be approved because there's not a parity of scale to back that up. So I think some of my colleagues in the audience will also confirm that sometimes it takes a lot longer than it should do to get a standard through in the UK. That's something we've learned. But when they do come out, the 2 pages, the approval, the assessment strategy ensures that those employers have got a really referenced qualification.
I want to follow up just real quick on this. You raised an interesting question about the difference in size of employers. Yeah. So in the US, we have this very coherent, clear system of credentials. That was sarcasm. But you know, in this context, you see some large American employers create their own credentials, and the entire market follows them. But what's the interplay between small and medium-sized enterprises versus large ones in this process? Do you see large ones saying, oh, this is for the small and medium ones to come together and aggregate their needs, or do you see large companies kind of being market movers and sort of setting the standards and the skills?
Large employers tend to take the lead, and with the support of the SMEs, it's about, for them, getting recognition for their workforce. If you look at our large employers, that's those with most likely over £3 to £4 million worth of PAYE, and our small employers are those 1- and 2-man bands that really make up the foundation of our economy. For them, it's about recognising where they can go and what they need for recognition with the big players, who most likely it's part of their supply chain. So that's how we get the support from the large employers to the SMEs, is looking at the supply chain in that industry. So there is a little bit of lead and follow.
Mm-hmm. What we're also seeing with apprenticeships, though, is the integration of professional qualifications and certifications into apprenticeships. So if we look at IT, lots of the vendor type qualifications, the Cisco, the Microsofts, the VMwares, are all integrating those qualifications into apprenticeship. And in the areas like banking and finance, so some of the financially regulated areas, we're seeing professional qualifications being aligned with apprenticeship as well. So as part of your apprenticeship, you achieve both sets of credentials.
Right.
On the
Please.
small employers, one way that a feature of the U.S. system that I think lets small employers punch above their weight is the group apprenticeship sponsors. In the U.S., smaller employers can work together in a group-sponsored program, and if new employers want to come on board, they just sign an employer agreement. So it's not at the scale, obviously, as in the U.K., but there's still kind of the sense in which the standards are developed and employers just sign on. And I think you're seeing more of that, especially as Department of Labor makes increased investments in intermediaries. Intermediaries are doing some of the same things that group sponsors did before. And so small employers aren't always out on their own. There are mechanisms like that help as well.
Right. So I'm going to be geospatially equitable and take a question from online. To the entire panel, do you see there's value in pre-apprenticeship courses? For example, basic math, reading, writing, enrichment that can be contextualized to fit the needs of an industry sector. So I think this question gets at the heart of, a lot of what we've been talking about are the skills to do the job. What about the skills to get someone ready? I mean, what are you seeing out there, both in Australia, the US, and of course the UK, to take those steps as well? Please.
Off I go. I think that, yes, I think getting an apprenticeship or getting the job is one thing, but keeping that job in this rapidly changing world is another area that really needs to be looked at. So I think it's this constant review process, constantly challenging and adapting to the changing marketplace. I think that's where it's really critical.
Do you have pre-apprenticeship type experiences in the United Kingdom?
Yeah, you go first.
Okay. So we have something called traineeships, which are for two different levels. So we have a 16 to 18 traineeship, which is about the level 1 entry skills, which is for us is English, maths, and a basic, this is what the sector looks like, and have some work experience. And it can last anything from 13 weeks to 6 months, just to get those individuals into the job and make sure we've got the right learner, right qualification at the right level, which is paramount to what we do. The 19 to 24 is more around the sector-based work academy methodology, where we look at what does the sector need? How do you get that person from A to B with the right qualifications to get through the door? So it could be as simple as someone going, say you're a bus driver or you want to be a bus driver. Well, you can't go and be a bus driver without a license. So for us, it's how do we put people through the basic knowledge, the health screening, the experience of sitting behind the wheel of a bus, and then getting him that job with the right people for work experience.
Let's head back out to the audience.
Yeah,
The chair of the conference.
Quick question. Can you say something about what you call endpoint assessment? Because it's good to have frameworks that say what people should learn, but you also have an approach to determining whether they did learn.
Yeah, so endpoint assessments are something that are new to the UK in terms of the way we're assessing whether an apprentice is capable and competent at the end of their apprenticeship. So they're new, they're being externally assessed. So there are a number of organisations, and there's some in the room from the UK with us, who are responsible as endpoint assessment organisations for ensuring they're testing and measuring the quality of the delivery and an apprentice has achieved the required standard and is competent. There are a number of gateway processes in most of our standards, so an apprentice will go through a number of gateways before they reach a final summative endpoint assessment, but that ensures from an external point of view that we're maintaining the quality and that there is some, national rigour. So that if somebody's being assessed through an endpoint assessment organisation, organisation, that those standards will be applicable across a range of sectors as well. They're not applying to every single standard. There are a few of our degree apprenticeship standards that don't have external endpoint assessments, and they're in some cases they're in regulated environments. So nursing is an example where, you know, going forward there won't be an external endpoint assessment because that's a regulated environment and only delivered by a number of limited universities that are approved. Does that answer your question, Bob?
Yeah.
Nick, you want to talk?
Just very quickly, very quickly. So I think earlier on someone was talking about employers not wanting to take on apprentices because they feel it's a burden, particularly in their early years. And this idea of you know, an apprentice being deemed competent in certain tasks and activities. So in the Australian system, there's opportunities for people to undertake competency assessment right through the apprenticeship. But the providers are also under a lot of scrutiny. There's a lot of quality, there's external audit, and very much around the brand. In Australia, you can't just say, I'm going to start up an apprenticeship program that's going to go for 6 weeks and the training provider is going to be someone who registered a company name and off they go. You know, lessons learnt. You know, Australia did go through that and very easy to dish out the licences and very hard to wind them back in. But I think, you know, there's such an opportunity in the US. There's so much opportunity to build this system. You know, look at the Swiss model, look at the German model, look at parts of the Australian model, look at the UK model, and build a model, you know, for the United States. And you know, I really feel that it's off to a great start. It's in a fantastic position. Not many countries have the opportunity to start designing, as it were, a system from the ground up. So I think that, you know, there's been a bit of critique about, you know, registered apprenticeship and where it all sits. I mean, it is sitting in an absolutely prime position. We've just got to get the word out, and, you know, the whole competency aspect is a part of that. People want to be associated with quality.
Right. Who, just for our own case, who in Australia is doing the assessing of the competencies?
So there are government-led authorities, and the actual auditing of providers is outsourced to professional audit firms. They put into a tender bid. My organisation just went through there's an audit every 3 years as an employer of 800 apprentices at any one time. And that audit's tough. It gets right down into the governance of our organisation. Who is on our board? Are they capable of ensuring that these apprentices are going to get a well-rounded apprenticeship? It goes through into occupational health and safety, policies, procedures. Are you able to deal with issues when an apprentice comes back or is returned? For whatever reason, are you able to, and do you have systems in place for complaints? What happens if a parent, an apprentice, a school, an employer, a partner is unhappy about the service you're providing? So all this is a part of the quality system, and I think that that's, you know, something that we're really proud of and you know, happy to share.
As someone who's been patient right here.
So wondering just about a potential unintended consequence. So in the States, with some of the licensure laws, which I don't know if you want to call those apprenticeships or not, but some standards that have been set, can have the unintended consequence of squeezing people out or preventing people from entering into a certain profession, which is good for the people providing it. They can charge a lot more, but we limit the number of people who could get in. So as you've created these frameworks around competency, are you seeing any of that? How do you balance a robust competency from something that potentially actually over time could squeeze people or keep people from actually getting into a particular field?
So the licensure issue is distinct from the competencies, and licensure at the state level has been growing for decades now, and just because a set of competencies developed for an occupation doesn't mean that a license comes along with it, right? And in fact, there are national competencies and occupational frameworks that Urban is working on, and licensure is often at the state level. If anything, I think opening up apprenticeship and making it more accessible with competencies helps people to meet the licensure requirements that are already there in a lot of cases, and there's no restrictions on entry unless we just think of the challenges of entering any rigorous education and training program. So I do think, licensure is important, I agree, but I think it's distinct from this competency issue we've been discussing.
But isn't there a challenge with some occupational licenses are not so flexible about the education and instruction you have to take to be eligible to sit for an exam? And are you bumping up against that as apprenticeship being a eligible training program for that purpose?
Yeah, I don't know enough. I'm sure in some cases, although I think you often just sit for the test and pay for it, and a lot of the education providers that do qualify for those licensures, the for-profit colleges, community colleges are the same training providers for apprenticeship. So I think it varies from occupation to occupation, but they certainly pose barriers, licensure does. I just want to make clear it's very distinct from these standards and the competencies that we're developing.
To the rest of the panels, do you find the standard, I think the heart of the question is, do you find the development of standards and the establishment of them across an industry restrictive to labor market entry for folks?
Well, I don't think we have, no. I mean, I work for, the largest university in the UK. We have 175,000 students. We're the open university because we have an open entry policy. So, no, I don't think we're finding, and I don't think other providers are finding that the standards are restricting entry at all, no.
Definitely not.
So we have lots more questions out there. Let's come right over here.
Well, I haven't heard much talk about outcomes.
Let's wait for the mic.
I haven't heard much talk about outcomes, employment outcomes like getting into job placements and wages. In the academic college realm, the accreditation system was always based on inputs. What's your library and what are you teaching, and to some degree, what's your curriculum? And increasingly, the movement in a lot of states is moving to what jobs are people getting and what are they getting paid? Performance-based standards that have at least some element of outcomes. How do outcomes fit into what you guys are talking about?
And
is
so
that parallel, different?
In this context, apprentices are employees already, which distinguishes that, but I think it's a fair question around sort of, it's one thing to say the skills are there, the competencies have been achieved, but what are these skills producing, both for the apprentice as well as the employer? How do you connect that to the work? Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, so
if I look at it from a provider perspective, we're measured on our retention success and our achievement levels. And in the UK, we have a minimum level of performance that if we don't hit, we're not allowed to deliver that standard again. That's it. So our minimum levels of performance are for the overarching standard. So we can't get away with just saying, oh, we've completed this element, everything's fine. We must complete every single component of that framework. And the minimum levels of performance are currently set on timely measures. So if we set an end date, we have a minimum length of stay of 12 months and 1 day. So we set an end date for that learner. If we pass that end date, then it goes into an overall rather than a timely. There's a bit more complexity to it, but from a point of view of timely, we as a country have a minimum level of, I think it's most recently something like 62%, but we're aiming for an average of 72% timely completion. So that's our success measure, with retentions up in the 80s and 90s. And in some industries, the success is up to 90%. So for that, we know that we're going to get them progression outcomes. So our apprentices that go from intermediately to advanced should then progress to the next level. And that's the other bit of data that we're looking at. So we try to get a sense that over 50% of our workforce then progress to the next level.
I've not been equitable with this side of the room because my head has been turned, but how about we go right here next? Yes.
Thank you. Earlier, Mr. Ramsey talked about the crumbling infrastructure and the need for skilled trades. And as we talk about broadening the occupations, have you found that the skilled trades and some of the traditional apprenticeships are suffering in any way? I don't think that we have a skills gap in HR and IT here in the U.S., so I'm concerned about how that would impact the occupations that we really have a need for.
Yeah, so from the UK perspective, I don't think we are seeing any detriment to the lower level skills. Where we're increasingly, as an economy, becoming a higher skilled level economy. Employers are increasingly tell us that they need to develop higher level skills. But of course, we still need construction workers and plumbers and electricians and hairdressers. And I don't think in the development of our standards there's been any drop off in the lower level apprenticeships per se. We've started to see an increase in higher level skills and the higher level apprenticeships, but I don't think we're seeing at the moment a massive fall in those lower levels either. So I don't know whether that answers your question.
Nick, you had something to add?
To the George Washington Bridge, I also have that fear when I cross it every time. I think that the whole skills is moving, upwards because of technology. So traditionally, to understand what metal fatigue was going on, rust and these sorts of things, I mean, someone would walk up there with a hammer and they'd have a way, or there was someone with a particular talent who's probably aging and retired. There's all sorts of technology that's now coming into play. Just a bricklayer. Now there's these things called semi-automated mason. I mean, they mortar the brick on the top, on the bottom, and lay the brick. So a bricklayer is going to be much more about understanding how to interpret plans, understanding. So I think the whole level of skills is going, uphill, and I think that it really is the responsibility of organisations, particularly, who are in like building construction industries, to make sure that they're embracing technology and making sure that particularly young people aren't fearing it, that they're actually embracing it and saying, how can that get us away from dangerous, repetitive work?
So I'm going to take moderator's prerogative here. We only have a couple minutes, and I've got a question online that echoes one I wanted to ask, which is around sort of defining these skills and competencies as a process. But yes, to your point, Nick, technology has created higher skills thresholds, but technology also means the skills are changing faster and faster on a job. How do we make sure, in a couple words, sort of how these processes keep up to speed with accelerating changes in terms of how work's done from firm to firm?
I think from a competency perspective, our standards are renewed. We need to evaluate the standards and their worth to the organisation and see where we evolve with how we're delivering those products, but also those that are assessing, delivering, doing the on-site mentoring are fully aware of the changes. So we're not teaching old mentality, we're teaching the new and looking forward.
For me, keeping breadth and flexibility within the standards. We know the nature of work is changing, so being able to continually deliver standards with the flexibility to add new digital skills perhaps to every single job role, including a bricklayer, is really important in the UK. By 2023 we're going to have 9 million low-skilled workers chasing 3 million low-skilled jobs. So we need that flexibility to be able to continue to upgrade those standards and actually add and enhance the skills of apprentices as we go forward.
Rock solid industry engagement. Companies to compete and remain competitive have to be on the cutting edge or they're out in this global economy. So keeping very close to employers, keeping employers at the table at all costs is critical.
So American employers really value flexibility in designing the apprenticeship program, and so I think just monitoring the work process schedules that actually get submitted and approved and looking where they depart from the occupational frameworks could be a real bellwether for what skills employers think need to be added but maybe aren't incorporated in the original frameworks.
Great, well thank you. And no one said apprenticing robots, so I'll consider that a win today. Thank you all so much, great panel. There's so much more we could have explored. Enjoy the rest of the day.
Okay, we're going to move directly to the next panel, which is selling and organizing apprenticeships. And in a way, it's appropriate that this panel come after the discussion about financing and after the discussion about frameworks, because both financing and frameworks, occupational frameworks, are relevant to the selling and organizing of apprenticeships. We have some great people who have sold and a few people who have bought apprenticeships. So I'm looking forward to this panel.
Founder and CEO of Franklin Apprenticeships. Just to give you a quick background on who Franklin is, we are a consulting and capacity building organization with the mission to be America's answer to its 21st century workforce issues. Franklin was founded by myself, our host today, Tom Buick, and our other partner, Dominic Gill, who is back in the UK. We are focused on building an apprenticeship ecosystem to support primarily non-traditional apprenticeships, so things like IT, healthcare, advanced manufacturing, professional services, et cetera. And we're doing that in a number of ways. One is by helping to support employers to develop and deliver high-quality apprenticeships. We're also launching in the new year what we're calling Ask Franklin, which is a talent acquisition portal to help employers match to candidates. And people can go and ask Franklin, what is an apprenticeship? You know, how do I get paid? Employers can ask Franklin, who are the top candidates that meet my needs? So we'll be looking to roll that out in the new year. We also are delivering assessment methodologies and tools to our clients to ensure high completion rates, modeled after the UK, which has much greater success rates than we've seen here in the US. And then finally, we're using our Franklin Associates to help support this development of the ecosystem. And our Franklin Associates are US and UK subject matter experts, some of which are here today through the TAFE delegation. So with that, you know, I just wanted to talk about our topic a little bit, selling and organizing apprenticeships. And what we've seen, as has proven in the UK, we're seeing it here in the US as well, that apprenticeships are sold, they're not bought. So employers need to actually, you know, we need to go out and sell these things to employers. And what we're seeing from a Franklin perspective is, you know, employers are a little bit hesitant. There's some fear, there's some confusion about how to roll out an apprenticeship. You know, where do you get started? What is the cost? What are the funding sources that are available? You know, what is the, you know, kind of waiting around to see what the administration is doing. Kind of pointing the finger at educators saying, you know, you're not delivering the graduates with the right skills that we need. And also kind of some fear around, you know, investing in the training of these individuals that then may be poached, you know, and by other employers. So there's a lot of kind of that stuff going on, but it really doesn't have to be that hard. Thankfully, there are some organizations that are early adopters. They've proven that this cost up front, the benefit far outweighs that initial cost to set up an apprenticeship. So on our panel here today, we've got a number of leaders from their organizations that understand the value of apprenticeship and what it means to their companies and their organizations. And we're going to hear about some of those successes, what challenges they see as they look to scale this going forward. We'll also have our UK expertise here to talk about, you know, lessons learned and what some of the hurdles may be that we're going to have to overcome as we look to scale these programs. So with that, I'm going to give a quick introduction of our panelists, then we'll get into some questions, and we will definitely open it up for Q&A. So first, we've got Brad Neese. Many of you are probably aware of the successful South Carolina program. For those of you who aren't, Apprenticeship Carolina has grown over the last decade from 90 employers to over 900 employers taking on apprentices. And the apprentice numbers have grown from 775 up north of 26,000 during that period. So anxious to hear from Brad, you know, what he attributes that success to and what it looks like going forward for South Carolina. We have Michael Bolton, who is VP at Maximus in the Human Services division, and Michael is really responsible for driving an internal apprenticeship that Maximus is taking on in the Human Services Case Manager role. He's also working on developing a broader apprenticeship opportunity for Maximus clients. So the part of their workforce solution will be helping employers get apprenticeship programs within their organizations. And Maximus is a huge organization. If you're not aware, they employ about 18,000 people in health and human services in 6 countries. and they provide workforce support for over 290,000 people a year. So doing great things. We also have Ned McCullough. He's the Global Issue Manager for Skill Development and Education at IBM. Ned leads the company's public policy for skills and education across the globe, and he's really focused on advancing policies and practices that result in a better supply of work-ready candidates, improve incumbent workforce training, and also, how to use technology for training and development. IBM's been on the forefront of training and workforce development for decades. I think Ginny Rometty, the CEO, came out and said they were going to be hiring 25,000 people over the next 3 to 4 years, investing $1 billion in training and development. So big numbers there. She's also talked about the new collar role, the development of that new position that's based on new businesses that are developing. So things like cybersecurity, artificial intelligence, cloud computing. These are roles that don't necessarily need a bachelor's degree. You can train them, with partnership with education and on-the-job training, really get these people up to speed. So you don't necessarily need a college degree. And then Graham Hastings-Evans, who is our UK representative. He's the Group Managing Director of NOCN. Graham's been involved in the UK government's reform of apprenticeships and technical education, as well as developing some apprenticeship standards and endpoint assessments, really focused on endpoint, productivity, and NOCN is an international apprenticeship assessment and awarding organization. So with that, I'd really like to just get into the details, talk to these guys about, what they're seeing as opportunities here to scale apprenticeships. So Brad, I wanted to start off with you. Sure. You've obviously had some explosive growth over the last decade, and it would be great to hear what do you attribute that success to, and how you really got the community engaged in taking these things on, the employers, educators, as well as the candidates.
Yeah, well, the reason I think I'm asked to be on these types of things, aside from my incredible good looks and charm, that wasn't a joke, is I think that the South Carolina story actually provides a great deal of hope for this message. And just my quick University of South Carolina math tells me that we've grown. It's like tenfold. I think if we grow our national system tenfold, we reach this 5 million mark. So it can be done. And the numbers that Kim quoted, those are registered apprenticeship numbers. So a couple of things I like to note about that is I think a lot of times in these forums, the registered apprenticeship system gets beat up a little bit. And I'll tell you that we have a complete opposite relationship with registered apprenticeship in the state of South Carolina. We actually embrace it. It's easy, and I'd be glad to share some of that story with you too. But our story really begins, a lot of you have heard this story. If you have heard it, you're welcome to catch up on your emails now. I'll be done in about 3 minutes. We really began back in 2003-ish, where the state sort of commissioned a report about what our workforce needs were in South Carolina. And the report came out and said, hey, look, we have a lot of European companies. Wouldn't it be nice to have an apprenticeship system that can help these guys grow their workforce? Flash forward a little bit to 2007, and we actually created an organization called Apprenticeship Carolina. And at the time, I can tell you that my original goal as an apprenticeship consultant was to register 4 new companies in the first year. And I thought, impossible. There's no way that I can get 4 companies to do this. I knew that we were onto something when about a month later I had 4 companies in one day say that they wanted to have a registered apprenticeship program and how could we help them. And since then, it's just been lights out, and the growth has just been phenomenal. Where we have always thought is that what we wanted to do at the beginning of this is go as fast as we can, as wide as we can, get as many employers as we can, and then have what we've always called a sort of a deep and wide discussion. We've gone wide. We've gone as wide as we possibly can. We've grown 3,000% You can't do it much wider than that. So now where we want to go is deeper into the company's lives, and then ultimately maybe even start filtering into a little bit of the apprentice's life. I would say that there are a few things that we would attribute this growth to. One, and hopefully we'll get a chance to address this a little bit further because it was a point of discussion earlier. We do have a tax credit. I will tell you that a tax credit and the use of that tax credit assumes a tax liability, and also it also assumes that someone's going to actually claim that tax credit. So there's a love-hate relationship with the tax credit, but we can talk about that a little bit further. But the other main attributors to our growth has been where we're positioned within the state government with South Carolina. We're actually positioned with our technical colleges. We call them technical colleges. Y'all probably call them community colleges. That positioning takes Apprenticeship Carolina, and instead of us being the 6 consultants that you see on our website, we're actually consultants at 16 of our technical colleges. All of our WIOA group, a bunch of folks that are out selling us on our behalf. You know, our consultants, Amanda, Fern, Robert, that are out there. Actual apprenticeship consultants, by the way, if you want to talk to them, you're welcome to. You're not allowed to offer them jobs. But they to me are the main attributors to this growth. They actually take a consultative process. They take a complicated process to an employer who's interested in growing a workforce, and they help them do everything that they need in order to build that apprenticeship program. And by the way, if you're interested in registering it, we do that for you too. And it costs nothing to the companies, and it's been real successful. So those are really the main drivers. Where I see us going in the future, another interesting point, I heard a gentleman earlier say that he felt that the apprenticeship system was going to be aging higher. I will tell you that in our state, I see the exact opposite of a trend. We now have over 175 companies that are offering youth apprenticeship programs, 16 and 17-year-olds that are doing apprenticeships, something we never thought would happen, something I actually fought. Said we will never do that, and boy was I wrong, and I'm glad I was wrong. And but that's sort of where I see our future going with our apprenticeship system is more towards youth.
That's excellent. So I want to turn it to Michael as an employer. So we heard from this pretty much the state perspective and how they've been engaging with employers, but really, I mean, you've bought into the apprenticeship concept, the UK model. Having come out on the study tour last winter, what was the impetus for Maximus taking this on, and how did you get the leadership in your organization to really engage with apprenticeships?
Well, you might remember a movie a couple of years ago called Argo that was based on a true story of the CIA trying to get out hostages in Iran. And one scene, Bryan Cranston and Ben Affleck go and see their boss, and he says, well, what are we going to do? And they say, well, we're going to make a film, and that'll help us scout, and then we're going to get everybody across the border on bicycles. And he says, well, that's a bad plan. And they say to him, they're all bad plans. This is the least bad plan we have. And apprenticeships are not a bad plan. The reason I tell that story is simply that I think you have to get employers to think about what the alternatives are. If you're not going to do this, what are you going to do? And if you still have an existing need, then there's a place for apprenticeships, even if it's just trying that out and then seeing and expanding upon that. So fear is always a good selling point. So I use that a little bit. I think also I would describe the current labor market as maybe being a seller's market. You've got 4% unemployment. You've got 10,000 baby boomers retiring every single day, or at least being eligible for retirement. So what's your plan to fill that? Employers, I think, are more likely to take a bit of a risk than they have been in a while. It's been 10 years or so when we've really been in a recession, coming out of a recession, and a lot of those habits are now having to be revisited. So bringing up that issue, talking about, I think, opening up the pool of applicants. how much broader it can be by having an apprenticeship. And so Kim talked a little bit about Maximus and the fact that we run workforce programs, and then we also are developing apprenticeships, and then we have an apprenticeship that we're building internally. And one of the things that we pride ourselves on is hiring individuals, maybe from the TANF program or the WIOA program, who've come in into the work that we do. And what we find is those are some of the best employees that we have. So this idea about the concerns of employers around engagement and loyalty, I think there's a very strong argument to be made there that apprentices actually are more loyal and bring greater loyalty and greater commitment because of that experience that they have. So those are some of the things that we push through.
Mm-hmm. And then you and I also talked a little bit about what it means to your training infrastructure. So you're taking this on internally, and how is that how do you see that impacting training and consistency and those types of things going forward?
Yeah, we've been doing this type of work, not apprenticeships, but doing the occupation within which we're creating an apprenticeship program since 1987. And so when you have a long-term program, and particularly if you do that across different geographies and different offices, after a while, you don't really know exactly what your training is. There is no consistent training. And so another selling point was to talk to people about, hey, this gives us an opportunity to step back and reevaluate all of the different approaches that we may have taken and all the different slices of curriculum, and then bring them together into something that is relevant now and going to be relevant into the future, the next 10 years or so.
Great. I want to turn to Ned for a minute, and really would like you to comment on, from a global perspective, as we talked about, on work-based learning and the impact on employees, and specifically this new collar role. How do you see that rolling out? I mean, we've heard that IBM has hired, a third of their workforce in recent years has not had college degrees, and how do you see that playing out?
Sure, I'm happy to talk about it. So I'll talk about three things. One, alignment. Two, new collars. And three, the global models that are relevant to apprenticeship. On alignment, the lack of connection between education systems and employers like us is appalling. Here in the U.S., one of the ways that we've been working is to go into offices with the curriculum for a school close to a district office and make fun of it and show that nobody possibly could get a job if they took these courses. And the area where it's particularly notable is the lack of work-based learning. And that's critical because we need soft skills. The talent people at IBM would say that the easiest way to predict how far a person's going to move within IBM, and this has certainly been my observation, has to do with their teaming ability and communications and adaptability. And when the schools are poorly aligned, one of the things that they're not doing is they're not setting out to get folks the work-based learning that would help teach them these soft skills. So, as was mentioned, we are hiring a lot of folks. We have 2,300 openings in the United States at this moment. And because of the poor alignment, we can't find people to fill those roles. So we are looking at new collar workers. New collar workers are those people that we describe as having the expertise and experience, but not the academic credentials. So bachelor's degrees. It may be something that may be, for a variety of reasons, hard to come by, but may not be necessary for the job that's out there. And overall, it varies a lot within the company. It's hard to make a statement across the country. In some places, it is as high as 30%. In other places, it's lower. I think the people that are working on quantum computing up in Cambridge are probably not a lead place for hiring these new-collar workers, but 15% or so is a rough national number for the last couple of years. So we had this big alignment problem. New-collar workers were something that we were looking at, and we started scratching what is it we could do so we could hire more new-collar workers. And in other parts of the world, they actually have very good success. In the UK, since I heard a UK accent, we were taking a lot of people straight from their A levels through an apprenticeship program, and we have over 400 of those people that have come through right away. I think John actually visited the UK program while he was over there and probably took some lessons from that. In Germany, similarly, about half of our folks actually come through the dual vocational education system. So our approach was to say, well, if they could do it, and we have this desire to hire new collar workers, why don't we try to expand that in the United States? So some of the new collar expansion is just typical things, where we're doing internships. As a label isn't something to stop us. But we now actually are rolling out apprenticeships. We got our first roles cleared through the U.S. Department. They were great. Can't say enough positive things, particularly while John's in the room. But we're going to expand it now beyond North Carolina to Texas and other places. And the big draw for us is that we can fill seats at our clients so that when they are buying an IBM solution, we can point at ways in which they will be able to find the skills to use our solutions. It's no good telling somebody some expensive software or a mainframe and then not having any way to run the stuff. So this will be a very helpful thing for that.
And can you just comment on what roles you're developing here in the U.S.?
They're cool. I mean, they're right up the middle. So we'll be doing software engineers and people that are working on mainframes. So if you really wanted to talk about iconic roles for IBM, this would be those. The other thing is, as long as you hand the mic back to me, which is dangerous, we also have our whole P-Tech schools, the ones that have the 9 to 14 education. And I'll say those kids are coming through from the beginning with a lot of soft skills and work-based learning. They are going through what in essence is an apprenticeship because we work out the training and then we do internships with them. And they're actually scattered across a whole variety of different jobs. And since P-Tech schools are now being done by 200 employers, there doesn't seem to be any limits to how you can use this approach as long as you incorporate two things. One, sort of reverse engineering so the education is aligned, and two, work-based learning into the model that's out there.
Great, thank you. So I'm sorry, Graham, you've seen over the last day and a half or so, what's going on here in the U.S. related to apprenticeships, the low adoption rate relative to what you're seeing in the UK. It would be great to hear from your experience what lessons we can take from your growth.
Thank you for that. I am an apprentice, so I did an engineering apprentice a few years ago. So I suppose I live and breathe apprenticeships. Reflecting on what I've seen over the last couple of days, I would say you're probably where we were maybe 10 to 5 years ago. And there's a lot of the things I hear people saying, I go back and say, yeah, it was like that back in the 90s and the noughties for us. I think the thing that we started to do with almost our second generation of apprenticeships, which is broadly what we're on, with our trailblazers, we made sure that we produced a product, a commodity, which we can sell to the employers and to the apprentices that's worthwhile. In our case, the government has enshrined in law the word apprenticeship. We don't hang, draw and quarter you if you use it, misuse it, but we will chuck you in the Tower of London. And we learned from some horrendous mistakes that we had. And I was listening to your task force yesterday, and they seemed to be going with the same error that we did in one particular area. What many of our colleges, schools and training providers tried to do, and funders, because they didn't want to spend very much money, we will take an existing poor training program and we'll badge it apprenticeship. And that just failed. And I did hear somebody say that as a proposal yesterday, so I thought, not a good idea. What we did was to get employers properly on board, and we didn't start from scratch because we'd had about 10 years with the Sector Skills Councils, development of NOS, development of National Occupation Standards as we called them then, a significant involvement of getting employers involved, and we turned that up a notch. And we said all of our standards have got to be developed by employers. And they've got to be relevant, and they've got to be able to deliver both for the employer and for the apprentice and the economy. And I think some of the challenges that you've got are about getting towards real national standards, because you've got to be able to put people around the country, not only around the country, but internationally. We work in other countries, in the Middle East. Everybody's talking about, I want to get to international standard. So they don't want to be stuck with, I can't move from Illinois to Virginia. Yeah? They want to go, I want to be able to go in India. I want to take an Indian person and work them in the US. So we're moving, I believe, to international standards, and you've got to go there. But you've got to have, as we now have, flexible standards, yes, that allow that 80-20, that allow an employer to flex it to fit themselves, that allow a state to flex it to fit their priorities. So I think those are things that you can perhaps learn from us. Yeah? 10 years ago, we wrote standards, and some of them are 169 pages long. Sorry, Tom and I worked together many years ago. Yeah, so massive, very detailed things. Now we've got a 2-page standard, but there are detailed documents behind it. So you need to move to that, and I think you need to move towards structuring your employer engagement not on an employer level, and that's very dangerous. We have gone down the route of bringing employers together into groups across sectors. We have now structured our economy into 15 sectors under the Institute of Apprenticeships, and those 15 sectors will develop apprenticeships and we call them T-levels, the technical qualifications that fit around those in a coherent way. And if you do that, then you can start to develop the new jobs of the future. I was listening, I originate from the construction industry. I then went into financial services, and so I've moved in a few different sectors. But the way you're currently structured in construction is like we were structured 50 years ago. We have a levy, what you do is similar, but the difficulty is you're developing on existing trades, okay? Whereas our approach to design, pulling together the sectors, is that our employers have been sat there going, we need an assembly technician in construction. That's something, a completely new job. We need a digital engineer, we need this, and we need that. Because if we're going to succeed, we've got to start second guessing what the jobs are. Yeah. And we've got to start designing those. And I think that's been helpful. We are strong on quality assurance. If you're not a good training provider, Ofsted will get rid of you. Yeah? If you're not a good awarding organisation, Ofqual will get rid of you. And if you're not a good apprentice assessment organisation, IFA will get rid of you.
And you've had massive improvements in the quality over the years.
Have.
Yeah.
And as a result of that, I think the whole process of designing them properly has meant they're more worthwhile. So we get better success rates. And on top of that, the quality assurance and assessment models that we've got also help to drive quality and therefore drive success rates. Yeah? And we have I was the head of employment skills on the London Olympics before I did this job. And I learned a bitter lesson in that, and that was about failure rates. And we introduced a process of upfront assessment. And that upfront assessment improved success rates from about just under 50% to 70%. Because you're making sure the person is interested, they understand what this job is about, they're willing to do it, they want to do it, they've got the basic skills to go and try and do it, and then you assess them as they go through, and then we now endpoint assess them, because our employers want to know if it says that on the tin, they can do it. Mm-hmm. Yeah? We used to have a method of probably assessing 20%-ish, yeah, on a sample basis, and we found that didn't quite give us the quality. So over the last 3 or 4 years, we've been moving to endpoint assessment. In fact, we're the UK's biggest endpoint assessment organisation, and it's that introduction of quality, introduction of transportability that will make it something the apprentice wants to do and the employer wants.
Right. So we don't have endpoint assessment here. We're not even really doing the ongoing assessment. But so Brad, I just wanted to ask you, how do you confirm that these apprentices are getting the skills that they signed up for through these apprenticeships without testing them at the end? I mean, how are you measuring that? Because it's just different than what they're doing in the UK.
Well, we're not. But really, what's unique, I guess, in our system of where there is some evaluation that takes place is that the vast majority of our apprenticeship programs are linked somehow to one of our technical colleges. And so the education component of this is absolutely, it's measured, people are tested, a lot of this is competency based, all of these things. But really what we do is it's a company driven system as far as we're concerned. I mean, it's if we draw out a competency for your maintenance technician and you choose not to check the competency of that maintenance technician, then you're going to get the result of not checking the competency of your maintenance technician. I mean, they will be poorly qualified. And so what we do is, instead of hawking these companies and making them do assessments, we set them up on the front end of everything that they need in order to be successful with assessing their individuals on their own.
So it's up to the employer then to just...
It really is.
Yeah.
I mean, it's their program. It's a voluntary program. It's for their own good. What we tell companies all the time is, you don't have to do an apprenticeship program, but that guy over there is, and that guy over there is, and that's who you're competing with for your workforce. And by the way, if you're going to do it, you should probably go ahead and do it right. And which means that you're probably going to want to assess them. You're probably going to want to run them through some viable education and not just give them a PowerPoint presentation on the history of the company. You're probably going to want to have something that connects back to what their job is. And so, yeah, we take a very non-regulatory approach to this, and I think the results of that are that companies like the ability to be able to do these types of assessments on their own and assess people to what their standard is. And so I understand where that would get a little uncomfortable if I were in Germany or if I were in Switzerland or maybe even the UK, but that's sort of the American way. Is this is my company, this is my apprentice, this is my product, and we're going to train them to our standards.
Yep. Great, thanks. I'm going to go ahead and open it up to questions. You go right up here.
I have a question for Brad Neese. You mentioned Brad, you mentioned the tremendous growth in youth apprenticeships in South Carolina. Can you share what you think are the motivations and the thinking of employers in getting into that age group? Mm-hmm. And how do the employers have some assurance that the young people have chosen a field, that they have some good basis for getting into that occupational field?
Okay, so the motivation, that's kind of easy. 3.9% unemployment, or below 4% unemployment. You get to a point where everyone at the technical college is already spoken for. You can't recruit there anymore. There is 4%. There are 4% of our people who don't want to work. So we can't recruit over there anymore. And so what we're saying to companies now is, you got to go younger. You got to find talent somewhere, and they just happen to be sitting in our high schools. And the way that we're ensuring some of that you mentioned about, someone with the drive, the ability, and the interest in that particular occupation, is what we're doing is we're having companies interview kids that have chosen those occupation fields in their career centers or through some technical education. A lot of these kids are also dually enrolled at one of our technical colleges, so they're actually taking coursework that is relevant to that occupation. And so what we're not doing is taking an employer and putting them in the cafeteria and interviewing or asking this room of people, how many of you want to work in IT at Boeing? That's not what we're doing. What we're doing is we're taking them to the IT department at that particular high school, and we're saying, these 3 or 4 kids are really interested in being an apprentice at Boeing in IT. We think you should interview them.
Thank you. My name is David Greer, and I work in financial advisory now at Merrill Lynch. Before, I worked 11 years in manufacturing and finance in aerospace and consumer goods. And my question relates to going back to the fundamental of, I guess you say, reconciling the short-term profit motive reporting vantage point of corporate U.S. to the longer-term vantage point of, training programs, of apprenticeship programs. My experience before was that the leadership would want to train people as interns, but the issue came with, would the mid-level managers who would be the mentors and guiders of these persons actually have the time and incentive to want to see them progress and learn so that it would work out. So in your experience, Ned, Brad, Michael, how do you sell apprenticeships, internships, to your mid-level managers who are pushed to find success, make an impact, performance in the short term?
So I'll take a first crack at that. I would say maybe two things there. One would be one of the things I've learned from you guys actually around apprenticeships is don't try and sell it to the HR department, right? That doesn't work. So the way to sell it, to answer your question, is to make it a business decision, an operational decision. So it has to be bought in by the people who do have that P&L responsibility. And that was a little easier than I thought it was going to be, actually. Once you've got that, then HR are quite happy to facilitate that and support it because they feel like they don't really have the responsibility, but they're a conduit to it. So getting those champions there, and when you're choosing your mentors, it shouldn't be something you're assigned to do. That doesn't work out. It has to be something where the mentor wants to be a mentor and that they'll see that they're getting something out of it. And I'll try to be really quick here because this is my favorite story. This last weekend, my wife's a therapist, so I spend a lot of time around therapists, but not professionally, just strictly socially. And we were talking about this, and a friend of mine told me that there is a famous study called the Hill Study. And what they did was, why, I don't know, but what they did was they had somebody stand and look at a hill and evaluate how steep that hill was, how steep that obstacle was. And then they would do that with various people standing with them. And the upshot of it, which will tie in, I promise you, to apprenticeships, was that the more trust you have, that if you have someone standing next to you that you trust, your evaluation of that obstacle goes down. So you'd see it as actually being less daunting than it otherwise is. That perception is stronger, the stronger that bond is. And to answer the question, it's reciprocal. So what happens is that the mentor gets as much from it as the apprentice does. And so I think trying to find people who recognize that, who want to give back, who have that perspective, that's critical. You can't just say, well, you're a supervisor and now you're going to be a mentor. Those are different things. So.
Well, it starts off obviously with the idea that we prefer actually that education systems turn out graduates that have the skills that we need. But assuming that we're in this area where we're going to need to be looking for new collar workers and the like, it's a collaboration. There's a lot of stuff that the corporate folks in the business units can do to make it a little bit easier for the person that has the apprenticeship working for them. Training, for example, is largely developed centrally and it may be delivered locally, but most of the modules and the like are something that are going to be put together or bought from outside vendors. And the process that you go through to develop an apprentice is, again, not something that needs to be improvised, because a local business leader just doesn't want to make it all up. They would like to have something that is understandable so that if they're being asked to take on an apprenticeship, they know what is being asked of them. They want to be successful. And again, the other aspect to it is that it's actually worked. In the UK and in other places, the retention rates are higher among the apprentices. And so there's a pretty good track record now where you can go back to the local business unit leaders and you can say, look, you have two options. You can hire people that are fresh grads out of college, or you can hire these apprentices. The retention rate among the apprentices, in our experience, is 20 or 30 points higher than it is among the folks out of college. And you get to bring them along in the way that you particularly want. So I think being fairly specific and trying to take off the local business unit leaders whatever can be done at a distance, and pointing out how it's going to actually work within their P&L are both pretty good plays. That said, as said, there's also the fact that they feel good about it. And I think most people feel good about mentoring and bringing along people. And very often the stories for these apprentices are very positive ones. By the time they get to be an apprentice, we often know them pretty well because they may have been somebody that was in and around IBM and in different ways for a while. So it's easy to go back to a business unit leader and convince them that this is an outstanding individual who doesn't have a bachelor's degree but has everything else that would make them be a success. So those personal attributes, the fact that the track record would indicate that it's going to help their P&L, and trying to make it as easy as possible for them and specific are all things that make it a little bit more successful.
Brad, did you want to comment on that? Okay. How about you, Graham? Do you want to give some feedback on, what's worked with convincing the middle managers to take on the mentor and coaching roles?
I think that many middle managers in the UK face the same problem of getting the workers. They tend to now find, I suppose we've got a longer time at this, so there's more of a track record, so there's more learning from other companies, that if they take an apprentice, it's better than taking somebody out of college, because you've still got to train them. Yeah. You've still got all the grief, but you haven't got a framework and an organised way of doing it. And most people that get into the mentoring, they do it because they like doing it. They put in somebody back in. They remember what they were like when they were young, and they needed somebody to help them. And it's seen as a really positive thing in companies. And if you've been a mentor, then that will be seen as something that perhaps will help you get the next promotion, and will help develop you as a person.
Can I just say one additional thing? At IBM, the most important aspects of the soft skills are teaming and leadership anyway. So when you ask people to work with an apprenticeship, you're actually asking them to do things that they should be good at and that you're trying to inculcate in all the people that come along. It's not like you're trying to get them to play way out of position in terms of the soft skills. Nobody at IBM works individually, or at least they don't work for very long that way. And they're not going to survive if they have poor communication skills or if they can't collaborate and bring people along. So asking them to take care of apprenticeships is a natural thing for them anyways. In fact, it's probably something that they prefer to do as opposed to the alternative. And so knocking down the P&L questions and making it easier for them, those are just added things. But as you were saying, they like doing it.
Yeah, they do. And as you get through more and more generations of apprentices in a company, the person who's now the mentor was an apprentice. Right. They remember what it was like, and they start to take that learning into it. Yeah. And I think we're in a position, because we've expanded our apprenticeship programs, and we started doing that, almost 15, 20 years ago. We've now got probably more people that are willing, have been apprentices, very willing to be mentors and know what to do it, and it's part of that process. Right.
Other questions? Miles?
Hi, I'm Miles Ponsonby, part of the UK delegation. Now, Ned, you mentioned about the importance of soft skills, and that was actually something that's commented quite a lot yesterday at the inaugural meeting of the task force. Just wondering what the panel's views are of incorporating some of the soft skills and basic skills into the selling proposition to make it more attractive for employers and apprentices, so it's rather than just the core competencies.
It's in the UK system. Soft skills and we include formally within that maths and English are essential part of all apprenticeships. So you have to achieve a certain level of math and English, and you have to achieve behaviours and employability competencies as well as technical competencies, so you can work in teams. Yeah? You can innovate, you can communicate at different levels, and we see that as part of producing the rounded person. The apprentice is there to produce the rounded engineer or the rounded relationship manager in banking or whatever it happens to be, and it's got to have those skills as part of it.
And there's a starting point, actually a better starting point usually in business around soft skills than in academia. Most teachers, if you go to and you talk with them about how would you put together a lesson plan on teaming or communications, wouldn't have a particularly good idea. But anybody who's gone through management training has had a whole lot of talking to them about that. So for better or for worse, it's, I think in some ways, easier to incorporate it. But to your point, I actually do think it's an important selling point. When you're taking the roles through DOL and the like, if you only focused on what is the language that the person's going to learn, are they going to be able to do Swift or whatever it might be, that'd be missing the point. A critical part of what we can do back at corporate is talk about how you're going to inculcate in these people the IBM values and IBM culture, and how that is going to be something that is easier to do in this setting than it might be in some other setting. The reason we like the P-Tech schools or dual vocational education in Germany or in Switzerland is that it does exactly that. It gives an opportunity to drive that deep into a person's teaching, because you can't learn soft skills overnight. It's not like you can go to a boot camp for becoming social. You know, it's just not that way.
That's true. That's true.
And Michael, you've really focused on employability skills with the population that you've brought up.
Right.
Yeah.
On the, I guess, on our core business area, we do that with all sorts of individuals, and I was talking earlier on about this being an opportunity for us to go back and review and revise all of the trainings that we have and then pick out what we really want to use. And one of the things we're doing is mining a lot of the training that we may make available to career seekers who come into our job centres and build up those skills. Because one of the things, catchphrases we have is that employers hire for hard skills and fire for soft skills. That's our experience. So couple that with the fact that in the end what employers are looking for is A, someone who's going to stick around, and B, some level of flexibility, right? Because the jobs are going to change. So teaching skills like flexibility and grit and persistence. There are actually things that you can do, exercises to develop that. Even sort of techniques which kind of tap into meditation or whatever it may be. Those kind of things can actually be really quite powerful. And again, it's that formalization that you get in an apprenticeship program that allows you to put people through those type of things that they may not otherwise have experienced. And I think it's crucial. Yeah.
They've got to learn adaptability, and they've got to learn how to learn, because next year the job's going to be different. The year after, the job's going to be different. And we have a process where our standards are going to be reviewed every 3 years, so we have a sort of big change, try and bring them up to date. But in between time, everything's going to change, isn't it? Every 6 months, technology changes, and the person's got to be able to move with it.
It's just a small snapshot, but teaming, for example, most people here are familiar with the traditional classroom where you sit individually, work on individual projects, and get an individual grade. If you went to one of the schools that's done across the P-Tech model that we've worked on in New York, but in a lot of other places, you would never see that. You would see instead pods, because everybody works on a team on projects. And then instead of the teacher being up front presenting, you'd have a kid up front presenting back to the class, the teacher instead as a floater. So, you know, this can be developed. It just is a matter of setting it out as a goal or a requirement. The nice thing about, again, doing it back at the office is back at the office, that's what everybody does anyways. And so you don't have to try to convince teachers to do something different. Instead, you're telling people, remember what you did in your management training course. Well, that's what we're going to do here. So,
Got about 5 minutes. Tom, did you want to make a comment? Raising your hand.
Yeah, I just want to come back to the the retail marketing element of apprenticeships, because I was reminded, just being in San Francisco with Steve last week, who's getting his brilliant business off the ground, Elite Apprenticeships. Go and check out the website. But he's just hired 2 Americans, and I was talking to them about their background, and they're clearly very switched on individuals. They've been in sales, but they haven't been in apprenticeship sales. And part of the journey I know Steve's going on with his staff is to get them inside the product. What are they selling to employers? So the question sort of to the panel is, do you think that that's a skill set that's just so obviously missing at the moment here in the US, a sales force, not necessarily there's sales people missing, but a sales force that can sell apprenticeship, given that you can't have apprentices without employers?
I would say absolutely. And with that, Tom, I will say that we have a pretty deliberate process in South Carolina about how we want to sell apprenticeships. And so we've been honing this for quite some time. And quite frankly, right now, 2 of our newest consultants, they're actually registered apprentices as apprenticeship consultants. And we're taking them through that process of the things that they need to know and the language that they need to speak back to employers. Of course, they personalize that. They have their own style. But we certainly need to have the ability to look at things like a complicated registration process and simplify that for an employer. And we certainly need to be able to take an HR person from Michelin whose only desire is to make 10 new tires, or not 10 new tires a minute, and that's all they want to do. And take the time for us to uncover every single aspect that's out there that's in the environment that can help that company be successful. They're not going to have time to be able to do those things. And so to your point, we need more folks like that. I think what we've been able to do is grow the way we have with a deliberative sales process that now, by the way, if I don't say this, Bob Lerman will beat me up afterwards. It is fully embraced in our economic development process in South Carolina. So every single new company that is coming to the state of South Carolina gets an apprenticeship pitch before they even co-locate in our state. And so the sales process with us starts early and it starts often. And I will tell you that there are words that we stay away from in our sales process, and there are words that we've changed that we have found over the years that they scare employers, for instance, and so we just remove them. We don't say the word portable credential, by the way, because portable credential means that my employee that I just trained is going to go away. We say nationally recognized credential. You're welcome, Mr. Kentucky. So take that back. But so yes, to your point, yes, we are missing deliberative sales processes and people that can deliver that message.
Yeah, I cannot underline how frustrating it is. Trying to get somebody from the government to say what you're going to get and what you have to do to get it is impossible. And I cannot tell you the number of times I've asked that question. And I said, look, go. You got 30 seconds to lay it out because I'm going to have to do it for an executive. Tell them how the money works and what we have to do to get that. So I'm going to be disciplined about this, but yes, it's incredibly frustrating. We could use a little bit of a sales thing.
I would also say, though, that, we're where we are, right? So what are we going to do with what we have? And what I've found to be useful is to look at analogs. So you could say to an employer, hey, do you do a mentoring program? Yeah, we do. Okay, well, do you have a tuition reimbursement program? Yeah. Community practice? Yeah, we do that. Like, well, why did you pick those things? Why have you instituted those in your business? Well, because we were filling a need. And they're filling a need because they didn't do the thing they should have done, which was to have an apprenticeship program. But I think if you can point out, you've already identified the value of the components of an apprenticeship. That's a really powerful, simple way of going about it. It's not perfect, but it gets you a little further along the line, I think.
And it's almost not even using the word apprenticeship. It's really flushing out what the workforce issue is and then closing what they, if this is an apprenticeship program that we're talking about as a solution.
You certainly back them into it,
Yeah.
for sure. Yep.
Yeah.
I suppose we've developed that sales message to our employers, 4 or 5, maybe longer years ago. So we have a sales force in place, both within what you would call the intermediaries and even us, the endpoint assessors, that explain the benefits. But it's the commercial benefit. There's a real commercial benefit. You just need to take the employer through it, the business case for them as to why they should do an apprenticeship.
Yeah. Okay. We need to wrap up. I'm sorry, there's other questions. The panelists will be around for lunch, so if you have other questions, feel free to track them down. Really just in closing, employers cannot wait for the administration or for higher education or for their communities to catch up. We need to invest in apprenticeships now. We can help, contact Franklin, contact other providers that can help you execute and get these things going. And one last comment, we are hosting a UK study tour in January, so if you're interested in learning more about the UK system, we'd love to have you attend, and you can check out the Franklin website. So thank you very much.
Well, I want to thank all the panelists. I want to thank you for attending. I see virtually every seat is taken. It's better than most baseball games in the 9th inning. And just to make a few closing remarks, we do have a long way to go, but we've begun the process, and we've been seeing a very little bit, but we need more, of research in the United States on apprenticeship, and there's a lot more in other countries. We do have some volumes on our latest international conference. We have a few left. If you would like to learn more about that conference, just send us an email. Send me an email, blerman@urban.org, and we'll send you an electronic version. But what we've learned from that research is that even some of the most expensive apprenticeships have great returns for companies. We just had completed about a year ago a study of 13 companies, but 2 in great detail, where they really got into the company to see what was the nature of the return. And in one company, Siemens, which spent a huge amount, I don't know where Tamara's still here, so they spent at least as much as the shipyard in Newport News. And what they found was by having the apprenticeship program, they were able to increase the capacity utilization of that company. Because when people are away, the apprentices could take over. Sometimes the apprentices had a broader training, so could fix things more quickly. And that alone gave them, on an expensive program, a 40-50% return on their investment. In the case of the Dartmouth-Hitchcock Health Center, the apprentices were able to take over some of the functions that doctors were having to do with regard to IT and forms and so on. And they were finding doctors didn't like that, and they would leave. Well, the recruitment costs of one doctor more than paid for all the apprenticeship programs that they were doing. So there's so many internal elements of companies that end up being benefited by this approach. Now, but we do have a long way to go. We do have a long way to go. And I think we're going to need all of this effort, the funding, the frameworks, the selling and organizing, and we're going to have to continue this conversation, but not right now, because right now is lunch.